Mixed Messages is a podcast by Bree Graham and Emily Madigan, two mixed women trying to navigate the complexities of living between multiple communities in these divided times.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the biggest barriers to our democracy, voter suppression. Let's get into it. Coffee anymore, dude?
Yeah, I've had a realization that where I'm at mentally and where my body is at physically, coffee does not. It's not helping.
Coffee's not the move, which makes me really, really sad because I love coffee, but I need to cut it out to see if it's what's causing my panic attacks midday or if it's my brain causing my panic attacks midday.
Girl, it's literally that for me. Like I'll have like that happened to me like a couple days ago where I was like so tired. Like, and granted, granted, a lot of things are happening. So I like everything in me was so tired, and I had coffee, and I was like, cool, let's wake that up. And my brain was like, great, now I'm fully functional to think about all of the things that are awful right now. And my body was like, oh no, girl, I'm not there. So I was just like this, it was like this wired, and I was like, oh. Yeah, literally, I'm trapped. Yep,
I feel that. Where are we starting? Hey, Bree.
How you doing?
Oh, I'm living.
I'm living my best life. Are we, though? Are we living our best lives? As good as it gets.
Listen, we are living our best lives. We are living the best we can with what we have been given. Which is to say, not a whole lot. So here we are.
It's a quarantine dream. What do you have for me today?
Dream.
Stop.
What? You don't like corn dream?
I don't know. I gotta sit with it for a minute.
Let me tell you about some things today. So today we are going to talk about a topic that is as American as football, wearing American flags on our underwear, which is technically against the law, and fast food. That's right. Today we are talking about voter suppression. Blah, 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 blah. Voter suppression has been a part of our democracy, I'm using air quotes, since the beginning of its conception and has changed face over the years. Democracy, as it is defined by Merriam-Webster, is A, government by the people, especially rule of the majority, and B, a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation usually involving periodically held free elections. So the cornerstone of our democracy is the right to vote and the right to make your voice heard in the choosing of the people who are to represent you and lead our country. The power of the vote has been kept from many Americans for hundreds of years. The goal of voter suppression is, and has always been, to manipulate political outcomes, usually in favor of rich white men. In the beginning of our democracy, I'm using air quotes again, and it should just be assumed moving forward that I am always using air quotes when I say democracy. In the beginning of our democracy, only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. Some states even had it restricted to Christian white men who owned property, and those demographics represented only about 10% of the population at that time. After the Civil War and the ratification of the 15th Amendment, many states used the social restrictions of newly freed slaves to keep them from voting, using literacy tests and poll taxes to inhibit their ability to vote. Literacy tests that were given to modern-day law students who failed the tests. I mean, think about it. You are in complete power as a white Christian property-owning man. And suddenly, after losing a civil war, all of the people that you owned and tortured and raped and sold and maimed and tormented are suddenly free. Over 3 million of them. And all of the free Black men were suddenly allowed to vote and hold office. How do you combat that? Besides the usual tactics of using racist rhetoric coupled with violence, you look at the situation that you and your buddies have put the Black community in. You made sure, while you used them like cattle, that they didn't learn how to read or write, and that they would have zero access to money. So you use those forced social situations to your advantage in order to keep them from being able to vote. This is, of course, the era of Jim Crow. Violence at the hands of police, the KKK, which, what's the difference really? And white civilians kept many Black Americans from voting, coupled with poll taxes and literacy tests. There was a Black veteran named Maceo Snipes, who had risked his life fighting for our democracy overseas during World War II. He came home and intended to vote for the first time in the Democratic primary for governor in Georgia. There were signs up stating things like, "First Negro that votes will be the last thing he ever does." But he voted anyway. He fought fascists in other countries. He wasn't about to let it win here. So he went. He was the first Black voter in Taylor County. One night, he gets a knock on his door. His mother was inside with him, I think.
No.
Yeah. And he sees a white man on his front porch asking him to step outside. When he does,
Oh, God.
he is met by 3 other white men waiting for him, local Klansmen. He was killed by firing squad and medical neglect once he made it to the hospital. Sound familiar? All for exercising his constitutional right to vote. Killed by fellow Americans after he fought for their right to democracy. And he wasn't the only one. Lynchings, beatings, and shootings took place across that county. One of the biggest reasons, and I use that term very lightly because there is no reason for that other than blatant racism and complete disregard for humanity, was because Black Americans were exercising their right to vote. But Maceo and the 2 other Black couples killed at that time didn't die in vain. Their deaths inspired a young man in Georgia to step into his greatness and begin his fight for civil rights. That man was Martin Luther King Jr. After about 100 years of Jim Crow, we hit the 1960s and the civil rights movement that so many people who are still trying to suppress our vote love to talk about and praise, where Black people across the country, again, mostly in the South, were attacked daily for existing, especially when they were attempting to exercise their right to vote. After Bloody Sunday and the vicious and violent attack on Black protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, effectively bringing to an end the tactics used to keep Black Americans from voting at that time, and requiring states with a history of suppressing votes to submit their new laws for approval. Side story, this is a fun little fact that I didn't know, and honestly have never thought about. Did you know that the voting age used to be 21? That changed in 1971 with the 26th Amendment, barring states from using age as a restriction. That change was brought about due to the rise of activism of younger people, mainly students, protesting the draft during Vietnam and students' involvement in the civil rights movement. It still blows my mind that at one point you were old enough to be drafted to be sent to fight someone else's war, but not old enough to vote. So keep taking to the streets, kids. It works. We also went through a long period of time where we were not thinking about the accessibility of voting, either by ignorance or by design. The Voting Rights Act over the years needed to be extended and expanded to make our democracy accessible to non-English speaking people, the differently abled, and the elderly. Accessibility is important and necessary for our democracy. So you can see we have a long, sordid history of suppressing the right to vote for the majority of Americans. And honestly, try as we might, not much has changed. Sure, there was the 15th Amendment that allowed Black men to vote and hold office, and there was the 19th Amendment that allowed women the right to vote, although its limits were exposed when Black women tried to vote. But voter suppression is all about power. It's a tactic that has been used by elected officials to eliminate the people that they know would vote them out. And it shows up in many forms still to this day. Let's talk about a couple of them. There are the voter ID laws that require you to have specific government-issued IDs that can be both expensive and hard to acquire for people without transportation, people in rural areas, the elderly, the differently abled, students, anyone affected negatively by the economy, not to mention the voter registration restrictions. There's been partisan fear surrounding things like voter registration drives in the past few years. People canvassing their communities, helping to register people to vote, has been a part of the democratic process for generations. In 2008, after record-breaking numbers of minorities showed up to vote, somebody, Republicans, pushed back by using the false narrative that voter registration drives encourage voter fraud and put legislation into action restricting the rights of individuals and organizations to conduct these drives. Did you know that Black and Hispanic voters register through voter registration drives at twice the rate of other groups? 25% of our population is either not registered to vote or cannot vote for reasons we will get into later, and it is disproportionately people of color. Other democracies around the world don't put the onus of voter registration on the individual. The US does, because they know that it can be complicated, full of paperwork if you need to get the documents necessary to be able to register, and can sometimes be costly. And none of that is by accident. Moving on. There are the cuts to early voting. Early voting is paramount for working people, senior citizens, the differently abled, and is especially important right now in the middle of a global pandemic. Cutting early voting looks like Wisconsin eliminating early voting on nights and weekends in 2014, or Florida cutting it down from 14 days to only 8 days in 2012. This causes long lines at the polls, if you can find a polling place, because many of the states that cut early voting also cut polling locations out of, you guessed it, areas that are predominantly poor or working class or people of color. Guess which demographic is most likely to utilize early voting? I'll give you a hint, it's the Black community. Let's see, how else do the powers that be try to compromise our democracy? Ah yes, how about purges of voter rolls? This is a complicated one because it is technically law that states are to remove people from the voter rolls after they have moved or died, but only if they haven't voted in the last 2 federal elections. This can obviously be a prime place for suppression. Mistakes, air quotes again, are made frequently in this area. Some states do try to combat it by making public the list of voters that are up for removal. And when you are removed, you can always re-register and vote. But I don't know about y'all, but they have tried me multiple times this year. I vote in every election. I move a lot and re-register every time. In the past month and a half, I have had to re-register twice. I check my voter registration every week just to make sure they haven't purged me. So go make sure that you're registered. My suggestion would be vote.org. Oh, let's talk about one of my favorite ways that our democracy is being bastardized. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the practice of manipulating the boundaries of an electoral constituency so as to favor one party or class. It is essentially, as John Oliver puts it, drawing voting districts in a way that creates unfair advantages to whoever happens to be drawing the lines. So let's talk about real-life examples. Say you are aware of the people running for a government seat in your community, in your district. You've lived in the same house for 20 years, so you are active in your district and you know who is campaigning to represent you. And you are super excited about one particular candidate. They represent the changes you want to see in your community. They truly represent your best interests. You are so excited to elect them. You go to your polling place on election day, and their name isn't on the ballot. What happened? Someone used gerrymandering to redraw the district lines to move those in your candidate's community who would vote for them into a different district. Maybe they redrew the lines around the candidate's own house and neighborhood, blocking out those that are literally the closest to them, like what happened to Hakeem Jeffries in 2002 in Brooklyn, New York. And that was drawn by Democrats. Oh yes, Democrats are not exempt from pulling this crap too. Gerrymandering is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's supposed to be the practice of creating districts that are equally representative of the constituents residing in them, and they need to be redrawn because people move and people die. That's what the census is supposed to be used for, to see where different demographics live in order to create equal districts. The problem is, these lines are drawn by politicians. There can be states who are almost 50-50 in their vote for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but the way the districts get drawn, the seats can end up being filled 80-20 to one side. and it doesn't make any sense. In a clip that I found on John Oliver, listen, we really love John, someone said, that's not the voters choosing the representatives, that's the representatives choosing their voters. And they do it by a process called packing and cracking. Packing is putting as many opposition voters as possible into a couple of districts, and cracking is spreading them out as much as possible into multiple districts to ensure that they don't have a large voice in any district. Fun fact, it is not illegal to gerrymander for partisan gain, but it is illegal to gerrymander to suppress minority votes. But as we have discussed on here before, as far as minorities go, we generally stay with the party that isn't actively and blatantly trying to kill us. In more recent years, 2020, voter suppression has started to look like Republicans saying that mail-in voting is unreliable and that many use it to commit voter fraud, while 45 is literally telling his followers to vote twice. This completely false allegation has resulted in his friends at the U.S. Postal Service taking mailboxes away by the dozens from areas that are mostly, you guessed it, Democratic-leaning and predominantly people of color. I would also like to point out that traditionally mail-in voting helps the Republican Party because many of their constituents are the elderly. There are other ways that votes are suppressed. Did you know that the citizens of Puerto Rico, who are actually U.S. citizens, are not allowed to vote for the president or have voting representation in Congress? That particular constitutional right, according to our justice system, did you hear the air quotes, is reserved for states. Puerto Rico is technically a U.S. territory. Puerto Ricans residing in Puerto Rico cannot vote for a president, but Puerto Ricans who have moved to the states can. The same goes for the territories of American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The people residing in these territories are allowed to help pick the nominees in the primaries, but that's about it. We all saw this administration's offensive response to the disasters that have hit Puerto Rico in the past couple of years. After Hurricane Maria, many Puerto Rican residents came to the States, where now their votes are counted. If you know of anyone who has moved here from one of the territories, they may not be aware that they have the right to vote, how to register, or that their vote even matters. Talk to them today and get them registered. The next demographic is tied into so many of the sins of this country, it's nauseating. The suppression of the votes of convicted felons. If you have a felony in this country, in some states, you are not allowed to vote. It is something that many have been fighting. It is mostly down to the individual states to decide the fate of those who have already served their time. Some won't ever let you vote. Others make you wait for a long period of time. Others will let you vote as soon as you are released. And who are these felony-holding voters? Most of them are Black men. Because when the 13th Amendment was ratified, it stated, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." In other words, the loophole to replace slavery looks like privatized prisons and throwing people of color, mostly Black men, in prison for anything and everything, from looking at a white woman to having a nugget of weed in their pocket. Black men have been targeted. They turned slave labor into prison labor. There is nothing that separates them, except for the fact that inmates get a tiny stipend sometimes for the work they do within their cages. And they continue to keep Black people who have served their time underfoot by then taking away their constitutional right to vote once they are released. Essentially, keeping the status quo where it has always been. Have we made some strides forward in the fight for voting rights? Sure. But as it was stated in the documentary All In, featuring many prominent Black leaders, including Stacey Abrams, who dealt with some of the worst voter suppression in recent history, the documentary stated, "The greatest moments of progress are followed by the most intense periods of retrenchment." Reconstruction was followed by 100 years of Jim Crow. We had Obama for 8 years, and look where we are now. We are still fighting this fight, and we need to fight to the death. Our democracy depends on it. Our lives depend on it. All eligible voters should have their voices heard. So please, please vote on November 3rd.
So while we definitely have a history of voter suppression, we aren't exempt from it today. But because we are aware of it, we can do something about it. Did y'all think we were just going to give you that information and leave you feeling helpless to the injustice? Believe it or not, there are ways that we can fight voter suppression. Remember a minute ago when we name dropped Stacey Abrams? Well, child, Stacey Abrams, I hated that. Stacey Abrams is a name we should all be familiar with. Stacey has served for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, and in 2018, she became the Democratic nominee for the governor of Georgia, winning more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history.
Shout out to Stacey.
Come on, Stacey. Stacey has got it going on, you know, not Stacey's mom, but Stacey. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week. Bye.
No. Oh, okay. Anyway, and while she wasn't named governor then, she saw firsthand the gross mismanagement of the 2018 election by the Secretary of State's office. Stacey launched Fair Fight as a response to this as her effort to ensure every American has a voice in our election system. In 2019, she launched Fair Count to ensure accuracy in the 2020 census. Stacey is what I like to call an HBIC, and Fair Fight is a brilliant demonstration of the legacy of her work.
Remember a couple of months ago when 45 was fighting with the post office? Yeah. So as a refresher, because of COVID, people have been talking about doing mail-in ballots, which seems like a reasonable thing to do considering this pandemic is known to be contracted on surfaces and, you know, airborne, but whatever. So there's been a call to vote by mail. Now 45 has accused mail-in ballots of being corrupt and fraudulent, even though if you go on 45's website, on his main page is a link to request a ballot by mail. I just
don't.
Okay. Anyway, more than 70% of us are in favor of voting by mail. But 45's administration is trying to instill fear in this process, which is ironic because this is arguably the one avenue of government process that actually does things fairly. Meanwhile, the actual fear that we have about judicial processes, it's really easy to get sidetracked here. Okay. The underfunded... Okay. The underfunded and underappreciated post office is run by, is it Louis?
Yeah.
Louis?
He trash.
The underfunded and underappreciated post office is run by Louis DeJoy, I think, a Trump-appointed lackey who has been making cuts to the post office left and right. I mean, giving approval to physically remove mailboxes to make it more difficult for people to vote. This is a form of voter suppression. How can you help? If you are planning to vote by mail, get your ballot in ASAP. There is a high volume of expected mail traffic the days surrounding the election. In an effort to not overwhelm the post office, doing this early can really help out. Also, it reflects in the polls that Biden is ahead, and that is lit.
There are also resources like vote411.com that provides voters with the information that they need, and stillivote.org, which is an organization dedicated to work to stop efforts to silence our voices and empower our communities to act. But if you're still planning to vote in person, I cannot stress this enough, you have to be prepared.
Yep.
If you are able to go in person and vote early, do it. We can't rely on polling locations to protect your safety, so be prepared for long lines and the possibility of bad social distancing practices. Y'all, bring your hand sanitizer, keep your distance, and for Pete's sake, wear your mask. If you're not an able-bodied person, call your polling location ahead of time and ask if they have curbside assistance. You can also volunteer to help save voting rights by reaching out to or donating to organizations like Black Votes Matter, Let America Vote, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Claim Our Space and Claim the Vote.
Speaking of Claim Our Space, next week, we're speaking to two ladies working directly with the Claim Our Space organization. One of them happens to be the founder. Marla and Paula will be here to talk about voter suppression and the fight to be heard.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Mixed Messages. For more information, specifically information regarding voter suppression, go onto our website at mixedmessagespod.com. Follow us on all social media platforms and follow us wherever you stream your podcasts. If you like what you hear, leave us a review. The more reviews we get, the easier we are to find, and the faster we can get our message out there. For more exclusive content, join our Patreon. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week.